Hello, everyone. My name is Rakel, and I'm going to present today my thesis, which is titled Ecological Footprint of Reykjavík, Downscaling National Accounts and Informing Municipal Policy. So I will start with telling you a little bit about Reykjavík, and next I will go over the research question and the aim of the thesis, and then I will quickly go over the methodology. Next, I will go over the results and discussions, and then I will end the presentation on implication for policy. So about Reykjavík. Reykjavík is the capital city of Iceland, and it is the only city in Iceland. It is located in the southwest of the country. It is a municipality, and it is a part of the capital area with 6 other municipalities. And as of January 1st, 2026, the population of Reykjavík is 138,753 people. It is the most populous municipality in Iceland, with the second largest municipality having a population of 40,228. And the city, it covers an area of 273 square meters, which is only about 0.27% of the total area of Iceland. And a little fun fact is that almost 40% of Iceland's population lives in Reykjavík, and around 63% of the population lives in the capital area, and almost 80% of the population in Iceland live within an hour from the city. So my research question was simply, what is the ecological footprint of Reykjavík? And the aim of the thesis was therefore to calculate the ecological footprint of Reykjavík, compare the results to national ecological footprint, and then to national and global biocapacity, and then to look into how the footprint can be applied in municipal planning and policymaking in Reykjavík. So the methods, I followed a top-down approach that was used for Ontario communities by Dworzák et al. In 2024. And I used Iceland's National Ecological Footprint Workbook from 2020 as a starting point. I collected data on income, consumption, housing type and floor area, energy use related emissions, and gross fixed capital formation. And I gathered the data from Statistics Iceland, the City of Reykjavík, Housing and Construction Authority, and then the Environment and Energy Agency of Iceland. And I used that data to create ratios and scaling factors that I then applied to the appropriate components to derive the ecological footprint of Reykjavík. And in this presentation, I will focus on global hectares per capita results, both for the total ecological footprint and for each component. And this table, it shows the data sets I collected in the first column, then where I got the data from in the second column, and the data points I used and from what year in the third column. So for example, the population data set from Statistics Iceland provided the population data point that I used. This table shows the ratios and scaling factors that were created or calculated. You can see them in the first column. Then in the second column, you can see the data points that I used to create them, and then which component they impacted in the third column. So, for example, in the second row, I created the consumption ratios using the average annual household consumption by categories. And the components that were impacted were cropland, grazing land, fishing grounds, and forest products. And this is just a simple figure that shows the downscaling process. So I start with the national footprint on the left, then I apply the ratios, which you can see in the middle, and from there I get the ecological footprint for Reykjavík on the right. So if I take an example of grazing land component, I started with the national footprint for that component, and I applied consumption ratio for meat and dairy to derive the grazing land footprint for Reykjavík. So now we're on to the results. So Reykjavík's ecological footprint is 9.35 global hectares per capita, which is about 19% lower than Iceland's footprint at 11.51 global hectares per capita. And the main difference is in the forest carbon uptake component, which is the black part in the chart. So Reykjavík's footprint in that component is 1.05 compared to Iceland's 3.57. So there's a 2.52 global hectares capita difference, and that difference alone more than explains the total difference between Reykjavík and Iceland's footprint. And Reykjavík has a higher footprint in one component, and that is the fishing grounds. The footprint for Reykjavík there is 6.70 global hectares per capita, and Iceland 6.30. So the rest of the components, cropland, grazing land, forest products, and built-up land, they are all really similar or close to just being the same between Reykjavík and Iceland. So I'm going to start with cropland. Reykjavík's footprint is 0.51 global hectares per capita compared to Iceland's 0.52. So it's basically the same and contributes very little to the overall difference between Reykjavík and Iceland. And you can see on the figure how the component is distributed. So overall, the distribution is nearly identical between Reykjavík and Iceland. And the result, they suggest that pressure on cropland is driven more by Iceland's dietary habits and the country's livestock production system rather than by consumption patterns that is specific to the city. And since Iceland has limited arable land, this component reflects pressure on cropland outside of Reykjavík and to a large extent outside of Iceland through imports. And the main ways to influence this component include measures such as reducing food waste, implementing procurement policies within city institutions such as schools and nursing homes that prioritize low footprint food, and then supporting dietary change that reduce demand for products requiring high pressure on croplands. Then the results for grazing land, they are very similar to those for cropland. The ecological footprint of Reykjavík is 0.56 compared to 0.58 for Iceland. And as with the cropland, pressure on grazing land is driven more by Icelanders' dietary habits and the country's livestock production system rather than consumption patterns specific to the city. And pressure on grazing land occurs mostly, if not entirely, outside of the city, that is in rural areas or abroad. And the main ways to influence this component, as with cropland, lie within the food system, reducing waste of animal products throughout the value chain, implementing procurement policies within cities' institutions, and supporting dietary shifts that reduce demand for meat and dairy products. So for the built-up land, the ecological footprint for Reykjavík is 0.12, slightly lower than Iceland's at 0.14. Reykjavík accounts for 30.5% of the total built-up land footprint in Iceland, and this is a lower share than its proportion of the population, indicating that per capita demand for built-up land is somewhat lower in Reykjavík than in Iceland overall. In other words, residents in Reykjavík, they appear on average to use less built-up land per person than Icelanders in general. And this pattern is consistent with Reykjavík's housing market, where apartment buildings are more common and plot sizes are smaller. Smaller than in rural areas and smaller municipalities where detached houses on larger plots are more typical. But although built-up land represents a small share of Reykjavík's ecological footprint, it reflects a land use change that is difficult to reverse, and it also affects other components of the footprint, such as through transport and material use related to urban development. So decisions about where and how the city expands therefore influence not only the built upland component, but also, for example, the forest carbon uptake component. Then there's the forest products component, where ecological footprint of Reykjavík and Iceland is identical at 0.41 global hectares per capita. The result therefore suggests that consumption of timber products and paper in Reykjavík follows a national consumption patterns rather than reflecting a distinct urban pattern. Given that forests in Iceland are limited, the forest area associated with Reykjavík's consumption is largely located abroad in countries that export timber products, paper, and paper packaging. And since the forest land footprint reflects consumption of timber and paper products, which are often used for a short amount of time and quickly becomes waste, the main actions available to the city lie in procurement and the circular economy. So relevant measures include reducing the use of paper and packaging, setting requirements for certified or recycled timber in municipal constructions and renovation projects, increasing the share of recycled fibers in paper products, and strengthening sorting and recycling of paper and cardboard. So now we're on to the forest carbon uptake component, where Reykjavík's footprint is 1.05 global hectares per capita, which is 70.6% lower than Iceland's footprint at 3.57. Transport is the largest contributor within Reykjavík's forest carbon uptake, and that is consistent with the city's emissions inventory or accounting. So the main levers for change here is reduce private car use, shorten travel distances through land use and urban planning, shift to public transport and active modes such as walking and cycling, electrify vehicles and public transport, and limit car dependency through policy such as parking restrictions and traffic calming measures. And now we have the fishing grounds component, where the biggest one, where Reykjavík's footprint is 6.70 global hectares per capita compared to Iceland at 630. This component is by far the largest component, accounting for 71.7% of Reykjavík's total ecological footprint. This component is highly sensitive to data sources and method choices, such as data gaps, trophic levels, and discard rates. But previous studies in Iceland suggest that the standard global footprint network approach may inflate the footprint for fishing grounds. And because of that, I conducted a sensitivity case for the component. It was based on results from Jóhannesson et al. From 2019, where he reduced the fishing grounds footprint from 22.26 global hectares per capita to 0.67, which was a 97% decrease. So assuming the same 97% reduction also applies for this study, the fishing grounds footprint would decrease from 6.70 to 0.20 global hectares per capita. And Reykjavík's total footprint would drop from 9.35 to 2.85 global hectares per capita. And this component would therefore shift from being the dominant one of around 70% to accounting for only 7% of the total footprint, becoming the second smallest component after built up land. So these results, they suggest that small, simple economies, such as in Iceland, may expose uncertainties in the fishing grounds component. And here we can see a comparison to biocapacity. You can see Reykjavík's ecological footprint on the right, the red bar. In the middle, we have Iceland's biocapacity at 13.67. global hectares per capita. And when comparing Reykjavík's ecological footprint to Iceland's biocapacity, it falls well within limits. However, when compared to the global biocapacity, which we can see on the left at 1.52 global hectares per capita, Reykjavík's footprint is well above those limits. So what does the ecological footprint add to Reykjavík's current policies? So to begin with, the ecological footprint, it goes beyond traditional emissions accounting. Firstly, the emissions are expressed as pressure on land, which traditional emissions accounting does not. And on top of that, additional components of the footprint introduce dimensions that are not captured in current climate policy. Second, the ecological footprint uses a consumption-based approach. And third, the consumption of city residents is presented in a way that allows comparison with biocapacity of Iceland and the world. And that raises questions about fairness in the distribution of ecological space. And finally, since the national accounts provide the continuous time series from 1961 to the present, Reykjavík's ecological footprint can be placed in a long-term perspective. So for policymaking, this means that the key question is not whether Reykjavík is environmentally sustainable, but how much and where consumption needs to be reduced to move closer to a fair share and reduce pressure on global resources. For example, the forest carbon uptake component, which is driven largely by transport. This highlights the importance of reducing emissions from mobility. While the grazing land, for example, that component points out the role of meat and dairy consumption in the city's overall footprint. So the ecological footprint can therefore support existing policies by highlighting where current actions are aligned or not with what is needed to reduce the footprint. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to reflect maybe generally on policy making within the city. I start a little bit there and go then into the thesis. At the policy making level of Reykjavík, we are looking into the municipal master plan. And that is actually the plan on how the city will develop until 2040. And of course, it's mostly about the land use. Where we will have like development areas where the building areas will be and so on. But it also includes priorities such as climate neutrality, sustainable management of natural resources within the city, biodiversity, the circular economy, mobility and green spaces and so on. And in short, the plan is used to make policies on how to utilize, excuse my English, the available land so the population can grow within limits as much as possible, but also to make it a good city to live in. How can you say it? That it can grow within the existing footprint of the city, as well at the same time to minimize the depletion of natural capital, both locally but also globally. So that can be a connection to the master municipal plan as well. And just shortly again on the master plan, because when it's a widely politically connected plan that is done, and it takes some years and always have a political background to all decisions that are made. So there was a strategic environmental assessment made of the scenarios possible for the development of the city. And this actually led to the point that there were develop boundaries of the city, growth boundaries. So the city is not, the plan is not to expand, but rather to have a small place of the city built for the building area, and also to make it easier to travel around the city and have more services around for shorter travel distances and so on. So how can I say it? In a practical sense, that is a tool that we use for land use or the footprint of the city, we can say so. So when you're making a policy like a master plan or a climate policy, then you use indicators. And they, like ecological footprint, it can be complicated to calculate the indicators and so on. But without them, it's very hard to formulate actions to make something change. I have been working with the climate strategy for so long, and when Reykjavík joined the Covenant of Mayors, it's a European initiative in 2011, then it was one of the requirements to have like a greenhouse gas inventory. And I'm not sure that Reykjavík would have done that unless having to do it being a part of the Covenant of Mayors. What came as a surprise at that time was that transport was such a huge part of the greenhouse gas emissions within the city. I don't know, and it still comes as a surprise to people when I'm introducing it. But this has shaped Reykjavík's climate priorities. We are prioritizing on transport. Of course, there are a lot of other areas that we have to face, but how can you say it's not so easy to have to eat the elephant in the hole. You have to cut it into pieces and decide where to start. But then to connect it to the eco footprint, when we're using like greenhouse gas emission estimates, we are very local and only looking at what is happening in the city. So we have not been looking into like a consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions that we should, of course, do, but that is some kind of data that has not been available. We have estimated roughly, and it's like twice the city's emissions of greenhouse gases as it is today. But then, again, to connect it to the ecological footprint of Reykjavík, maybe on a personal note, I found it a little bit challenging at first to familiarize with the ecological footprint concept. It is a different mindset than from greenhouse gas accounting, which I worked with for many years. And the greenhouse gas accounting can sometimes be very technical, and it's like draw you away from nature, which it should not do, actually. And I have the feeling that the ecological footprint drives you towards nature. It gets you more connected, how your daily habits are reflecting not only Iceland's biocapacity, but in the world, just for the whole of the planet. There were also, of course, in the results that surprised me. I thought it was very positive that Reykjavík's ecological footprint is lower than the national average for Iceland. But of course, we were still above the biocapacity, which I actually expected, but is discouraging. I was also surprised by high fishing grounds footprint, but that is due to the consumption as well. But on that note, my role is often to be a translator. What greenhouse gases means, and maybe to be translate to citizens, but also to politicians, and also to my co-workers, what this means. So for myself to understand the ecological footprint, I think it's important to translate it or have a communication with my co-workers on further on. And how can I say it? It was a key lesson for me that the ecological footprint, the indicators, they can actually support both climate policy and urban planning. It is, for example, clear that the food system priorities can be integrated into our internal environmental management system that is called Green Steps of Reykjavík. There's a kind of initiative that can be worked with all the employees of Reykjavík City. Procurement is a good point. There's another area that could be strengthened. That is something that we have been working on. I was also thinking about the forest carbon uptake. And again, I think it's about the policy of the local policy. It's, how can I say, it's a policy to not have an industry within the municipality. You can seek for a different kind of industries or businesses and so on. So it's also a planning opportunity to actually choose businesses that have a lower ecological footprint and industries and so on. So that is also, again, supporting the climate policy and the kind of businesses that the municipality want to attract. I also must say that Rakel has not yet had the opportunity to present this within the city, but I hope that will happen soon. I'm also excited to follow how Reykjavík's ecological footprint would evolve over time. And I would also be very interested to hear the reflection from colleagues on this matter and how they would perceive this approach to how can you say it, like an input to the policy making and so on. But I'm very thankful for this partnership, and I hope this reflection has been of some use and understanding on policy making within Reykjavík City and how it can be connected with the ecological footprint. Thank you.